Today we're looking at Berkeley's arguments against material substance. While it may seem strange that he's arguing against the material of objects, which we all take as a basic truth of common sense, Berkeley's really interested in defending religion against the new scientific philosophy. And he wants to show that there are just as many absurdities and just as many strange things about believing in the strange type of material substance assumed by modern science as there is in believing in the truths of religion. He's going to argue that his subjective idealism, believing that material objects are ideas in our mind projected into us by God, actually preserves more of our common sense intuitions than the idea that they exist independently outside of us as a substance that has primary properties, as Locke or Descartes would have thought. And we'll talk more about how he's going to preserve common sense in the next lecture. So the argument goes in 3 steps. He's first of all going to reiterate some of the arguments we've already heard, that secondary qualities exist only in the mind and are merely subjective. The second stage of the argument then is to show that primary properties can't be separated from secondary qualities. This is going to depend upon his attack on abstract ideas that we looked at last time. And then once he shows that primary properties always go along with secondary properties, if secondary qualities must be in the mind, then primary properties must only exist in the mind as well. And then lastly, he's going to attack the idea of a material substance or substratum that underlies the properties of objects. Whereas Locke had said there was an abstract idea of substance, which was a something I know not what, which lay under our experiences of the powers or properties of objects. Berkeley is going to try to argue that the very idea of a material substance is an absurdity. So let's start with his arguments against secondary properties. We see that secondary qualities always involve pain or pleasure. Whenever we perceive color, we like it or we don't like it. Warmth and coldness are associated with pain. We had seen from Galileo's arguments that we don't believe that the feather has a tickle inside of it, or that the pin has pain inside of it. So since all of the other secondary qualities like color, warmth, sound, texture, touch, smell, and taste, they also involve pleasure and pain with them and can't be separated from them. We have to think that all of those properties are just as restrained to the mind as pleasure and pain. We believe pleasure and pain are tied into the mind. And since we can't separate out in abstract properties or abstract ideas the pleasure we feel at a color or at a sound or a texture or a taste from the taste itself, that would be an impossibility according to Berkeley's rejection of abstract ideas. If one is in the mind, if pain is in the mind, or pleasure is in the mind, or the reaction is in the mind, then those properties must be in the mind as well. The other arguments are similar. The second argument is very similar to the one that Locke gives, that secondary qualities are capable of contradicting themselves in the same object. Berkeley gives the famous example of taking your arm and sticking it in a tub of hot water, and then sticking that same arm into a tub of cold water. When you first stuck your arm into the hot water, it may have felt cool. And when you stick it into the cold water, it will feel even more cool. You can take the same vat of water that's lukewarm and take the hand that was in the hot water and stick it in the lukewarm water. It'll feel very cold. And then if you stick the hand that was in the cold water and stick it in the lukewarm water, it'll feel very hot. Since the very same object can have contrary appearances, or in our famous is the dress yellow or blue, can appear contrary to different people under different conditions. So we have to believe that the sensible qualities of things cannot really be in the object, since they're capable of contradicting themselves. So in the same way that we said that pleasure and pain can't be separated from warmth or color or sound, so if we reject the idea of abstract ideas, we can see that primary properties like length, shape, size, number can also not be separated from secondary qualities. So we can never see movement without it being a movement of some colored object. We can never feel an object and feel its length or its size without feeling also some degree of warmth or touch. So if ideas are always concrete and particular, and you can't abstract out the primary from the secondary, then if we must admit that secondary qualities are in the mind, then we have to admit the primary qualities are in the mind. And that same argument that we looked at for secondary qualities, that they're capable of contradicting themselves, the same water can feel both hot and cold, we can see that really size and motion and even shape and all primary properties are relative to perspective as well. To somebody who was the size of a mite, my finger would appear very giant, but to somebody as tall as a mountain, my whole body would appear very tiny. The way shape appears to us is different with perspective. Remember, Berkeley had written his first book on the geometry of perception, and how what we actually perceive, what an artist would draw, varies with the perspective that we're taking from it. There's a fairly humorous example of the relativity of size in this Kids in the Hall video that's embedded here, that you can click on by looking at the link. And the guy is pretending to crush people's heads because their heads can appear very small when they're far away in comparison to his hand. In the same way people take pictures of themselves holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa or holding the moon, because of the way in which the sizes of things change with perspectives. The moon appears to be very, very large when it's closer to the horizon and becomes much smaller when it rises higher in the sky. So all the same property qualities and all the same arguments that are applied to secondary qualities apply to primary qualities. So instead of believing that they're unique in being outside of us, Berkeley thinks we have to admit that they as well are only ideas that we perceive in our mind. By far the most important argument is the last argument that Berkeley gives, once he's shown that primary qualities can't be said to be things that exist outside of us, as Locke said, as powers of the object. So he thinks that we can't even believe in this abstract idea of a substance or a substratum that underlies those qualities outside of us and explains those powers. Sometimes this argument is so important it's called the canonical argument. It's called that because Berkeley's willing to bet the whole argument upon it. He says if you can conceive it possible for one extended substance or anything like an idea to exist otherwise than in a mind perceiving it, I'll readily give it up. And if you say that you can think of trees or parks or closets or books without a mind thinking of them, he says that you're conceiving them, trying to imagine them unconceived, or thinking of them unthought of, which is a manifest contradiction, he says. This is a version of the argument that you sometimes hear. Wherever you go, there you are. Anything that you're thinking of is just a thought and not something outside of you. So Berkeley finally comes to the conclusion that Descartes' Archimedean standpoint, where you could grasp something that was apart from your thought, apart from your ideas, is an error. Berkeley thinks it's impossible for us to think of anything but our own thoughts. If we think that the mind's eye model, or the representational model of knowledge that we started with, is true, then Berkeley says we have to admit that all we're ever really thinking of is our own thoughts. So look and see how we can try to interpret that argument a little more rigorously. The first version of it simply looks at the surface contradiction that Berkeley tries to draw. What we conceive directly are only ideas in the mind. That's just the mind's eye model. The second premise says, assume, this is an argument that works by reductio ad absurdum, so we're trying to imagine what we're trying to disprove. So we assume that we can conceive a material object existing outside the mind. But if we conceive it, that means it doesn't exist outside the mind, since all we conceive directly are only our own ideas. So thinking of a material object existing outside the mind is thinking of something unthought, or conceiving something that is unconceived, which is a contradiction. So it must really be impossible to conceive of a material substance existing outside the mind. Now, typically this has been thought to make a fairly elementary confusion between a picture and what it's a picture of, or the representation and the content of that representation. This was the formal and objective reality that Descartes had distinguished before. So when I say the word red, the word is a black set of shapes on your screen, whereas what it represents is not black at all. It's the actual color red. When I say the word tree, the tree with its branches and leaves doesn't appear on the screen. So there's a difference between the properties of the representation and the properties of the thing that it represents. So premise 1 is talking about the properties of the representation, that it's in your mind, whereas premise 2 is talking about the content. So this fallacy is sometimes called equivocation. The meaning of a term shifts from the representation itself in the first premise to the reference, or what the object is about, or what the representation is about in the second premise. So let's see what a better version of this argument would look like. And in this second version, we're getting at the real assumption that Berkeley makes about ideas. Remember, we said that modern philosophers, the empiricists in particular, progressed by getting more clear about what an idea was. So Berkeley thought that an idea was a concrete picture, having all its specifics, which couldn't be abstract. And he thought it represented by similarity, by being a good picture of its object. So you can think of a photograph of you, and you can look at it next to you, and you can see that the photograph is a good picture because it's similar to you. And both you and the picture that you're looking at are both ideas in your mind. So we think ideas represent through similarities, but Berkeley says nothing can be like an idea but another idea. And he's going to say that ideas are passive and unextended things. They don't have agency or activity, and they don't exist in space and time. They can't possibly represent extended material objects or any active entity. It would be like trying to draw a picture of a stable mountain on the moving surface of a wave or water. Ideas are unextended things and are passive, so they can't possibly represent things that are extended or material objects. So if that's true, then an idea cannot possibly even represent or be about a material substance. Therefore, it's impossible to conceive of a material substance existing outside the mind, because since nothing can be like an idea but another idea, whenever you try to think of a material substance outside of your mind, then you're always just thinking of another idea, because that idea is just a picture of another idea. So this is similar. I should remind you of our discussion in Descartes when we asked how could we verify, if I gave you a picture of something happening out in the quad, how could you verify that? We pointed out that, well, you could take a picture of you taking the picture, or you could set a picture next to another picture of the actual object. Berkeley's pointing out that if all we can perceive directly are pictures, then there's no way of ever connecting up our picture with something outside of it, because a picture can be nothing like nothing but another picture. The only thing it could possibly represent would be something that it bore some similarity to. Now you can see that this doesn't show that material objects don't exist. It just shows that we can't think about them. Later we'll see a philosopher, Kant, who's going to argue that things do exist outside of our mind, despite the fact that we can't think about them. So Berkeley we can give another interpretation of Berkeley's argument that attempts to answer that objection. The first part of the argument looks just like the version 2.0. An idea represents through similarity, but it can't be similar to or be like anything else but another idea. So an idea can't represent or be about a material substance. The difference is that premise 5 is added, which says anything that can't be thought is impossible, so that the fact that you can't think it means that it can't exist. We're going to see next time that Berkeley, in order to allow for the fact that we could perceive God and that we could have ideas of our own mind and of our own volition and of souls, believed that there had to be another type of representation besides ideas, which were active representations. Since ideas are passive, unextended things, they can't represent material objects, but because they're passive things, they also cannot represent the human soul or God or actions. So Berkeley's going to introduce a different type of representation called a notion that we'll talk about in the next lecture. So Berkeley would accept premise number 5 only if we included notions as well as ideas as thoughts, because the soul and God are going to be said to exist, even though we can't form any idea of them, because ideas are passive, whereas these things are active. But the basic idea is that, as the empiricist would say, nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses, and we can also not admit anything to exist which can't be in the senses. And this argument has tried to show something about the very nature of representation. If it represents by similarity, then it will never represent anything outside of ideas, because only an idea can be like another idea. I'm just going to mention quickly a couple contemporary versions of Berkeley's argument that have continued to gain interest. This one is called the brain in a vat argument, which was given by the Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam in the 80s. It starts from a version of Descartes' dream argument. We already saw that it might be possible that you were a brain in a vat, and instead of perceiving the real world, you were perceiving signals from a computer, like in the Matrix, that produced images of a virtual world in which your body and a vat existed in this virtual world. And Putnam gives an argument, just like Berkeley's, that it's impossible that there could be a world outside of our experience in which we were a brain in a vat. In fact, that it's impossible for us to speak of there being a world outside of our experience at all. And his argument is similar to Berkeley's, whereas Berkeley said nothing can be like an idea. So whenever you have an idea, it's only about another idea. It's only talking about another idea. It can't possibly be about something outside of us. Putnam's view is based upon the idea that the meaning of our language is determined by the objects and things that we interact with. So if you were living in the Matrix, or living in this virtual world, the world up here, and you said to yourself, "I'm a brain in a vat," and you uttered that sentence, the meaning of those terms would be connected to only the things that you would have interacted with, which would have been the virtual reality brain and the virtual reality vat. It couldn't possibly refer to the real world or a real vat because you've never had any interaction with the real vat that you're embedded in, or the computer that's giving rise to those images or experiences. Just as the people in the Matrix couldn't have had any idea or even talked about the vat which was holding them alive and using them as a battery. So Putnam's argument is that our language can only talk about the types of things that exist within our virtual reality or within our constructed world. Another famous argument that deals with the issues that Berkeley talked about has become popular recently as what's called speculative realism. Quentin Meillassoux, a French philosopher, wrote a book called After Finitude in 2008, in which he tried to prove that there was some reality outside of human experience. He tried to refute Berkeley by talking about what he calls the ancestral. The ancestral would be the things that existed before any human beings were around to have ideas of them, like dinosaurs or the Big Bang or the creation of the Earth. And he tries to refute or identifies an argument that is basically Berkeley's argument that he calls correlationism. The argument that he's trying to refute says that any knowledge we might have of dinosaurs or of the Big Bang would really only be correlated with some idea that is still, or some experience that we have within this world. We see fossils, we see evidence of the background radiation, so we still, correlationism, which Meillassoux disagrees with, is Berkeley's argument that every idea just correlates with another idea because an idea can't possibly be about or like or similar to anything but an idea. So Berkeley's argument, as silly as it seems, is an argument that still is taken seriously by contemporary philosophers, and we see it being discussed and advanced again in different forms by various different contemporary philosophers. And that's because it's an argument really about the nature of language, or the nature of representation, and the limits of language and the limits of representation, and only accidentally about the nature of reality outside of us.